The Taviani Brothers, Paolo and Vittorio, have been Italian filmmaking icons known for their distinctive style and profound storytelling. With a career spanning over 5 decades, they crafted cinematic masterpieces that captivated audiences worldwide. The BFI, in collaboration with Cinecittà, has decided to celebrate them by presenting a retrospective curated by Adrian Wootton OBE.
I chose to do the retrospective on the Taviani Brothers because I thought it was well overdue for their work to be more widely seen in the UK. There's a number of their films have been released over the years, of course, but not everything has been released in the UK, and not everything has been shown at film festivals in the UK. So I really felt it was important to show the full range of their work and give the UK public and the audiences in London a chance to see a whole snapshot, really, a picture of their 60-year career.
This is not the first time that Adrian Wootton OBE curates a season about an Italian director. In 2018, he did it about Marco Bellocchio. What strikes him about Italian cinema?
I'm a great admirer of Italian cinema. I've always loved Italian cinema, and I know we know all the great names of the past of Fellini and Visconti and Pasolini, and contemporary filmmakers like Moretti and Paolo Sorrentino and Alba and Alice Rohrwacher, or we know these names, but I think there are other great names of Italian cinema who've made extraordinary movies, and certainly the UK public isn't as aware of them. So for me, it's a passion to make the audience aware of the full breadth and history of Italian cinema. I'd been a great admirer of Marco Bellocchio for many years. I met him. I've introduced his work on stage at the London Film Festival and other events, Cinema Made in Italy events here, and I felt that he really richly deserved that. And I felt the same way about the Tavianis. I think they're extraordinary artists, extraordinarily great filmmakers who've not only contributed to the breadth, the depth, the wealth and richness of Italian cinema, but have contributed to world cinema. And their originality is something that I really wanted to get the opportunity for a British audience to know more about, and to see some other fantastic examples of their work in addition to the ones that we perhaps are a bit more familiar with. So it was really important to me to try and get the audience to understand their place in Italian and world cinema in a way that they perhaps are not as familiar with at the moment.
Cinema is about sharing with the audience. What gift will the audience receive from this retrospective?
I want to offer with this retrospective the gift of seeing some movies, seeing some extraordinary creative stories that are magical cinema, that shows the power of cinema and how the Tavianis are really unlike any other filmmakers in Italy, and actually unlike any other filmmakers, I think, in the world, that they've made so many different kinds of films, but they are all linked by their extraordinary cinematic imagination. And I really hope the audience will get to understand more about them, and will get to love some more of those films in the way that I love them, and it will spark their imaginations, and they'll get the same pleasure and understanding from those films that I've gained from having watched them over so many years.
Among all of the Taviani movies, which is Adrian Wootton OBE's favourite?
It's a really difficult question, because there's lots of their movies I really love. You could pick you could pick films from their earliest career, their first movie, This Man for Burning, or you could pick their big first really massive success in Padre Padrone, Father and Master, which is a masterpiece. It's a great movie. And in more recent years, I loved Caesar Must Die, and actually I had an opportunity to host both Paolo and Vittorio here at the London Film Festival in 2013, when they both came and talked about that movie. But I have to say, there's a very special place in my heart for The Night of Shooting Stars, which, you know, is probably their single most famous film after Caesar Must Die, and I think is so extraordinary because it's autobiographical. But it's not just a war film. It's a film again about the power of imagination. It's about the power of cinema. It's romantic and sad and moving, and so I'd have to. I guess I'd have to, if I was forced to, say The Night of Shooting Stars, because I just think it's such a beautiful, haunting film.
Talking about technique, which is the one most used by the Taviani brothers that for Adrian Wootton OBE is more remarkable?
I think they do many things brilliantly, and technically and creatively. I think there are the two things that I would point out. Well, maybe three. There are three things that I think I would point out. One is their use of locations, landscape. They're very much exterior directors rather than interior directors, and the landscape is another character, whether it's the landscape of Umbria or whether it's the landscape of Sicily, or where they come from, which they use the most, Tuscany, and the way they use the landscapes of Tuscany in Night of the Shooting Stars, in Chaos, in so many, in Elective Affinities. There's so many films that they make the landscape an extra part, an extra dimension. I think that's extraordinary. I think the way in which they managed to thread multiple stories together. They could be short stories of Pirandello in things like Chaos or You Laugh. They could be Boccaccio stories in Wondrous Boccaccio. But they managed to have this incredible ability to shift scenes and yet and use different stories and yet create a consistent thematic thread where you're absolutely entranced by what they're doing. And the third thing is the way in which they may manage to mix real naturalism, that, you know, they were influenced by Rossellini, authentic, almost drama documentary, with extraordinary cinematic playfulness and imagination. There's a famous scene in Night of the Shooting Stars, which is actually a horrible kind of fight, a sort of massacre by fascists of peasants in a field, and this young girl is watching this, and as she watches it, she dreams that the Roman legions, the Roman soldiers, will come and save her friends from this massacre, and these imaginary soldiers appear, and that's just a classic example of how the Tavianis play with realism and fantasy in the same scene, and it's one of the really brilliant hallmarks of their work. And so for that's just three examples, but three reasons why they're so original and such great imaginative cinema artists.
The Taviani brothers' name is linked to the cinema world from the 60s till today. How contemporary are the stories narrated in their films still?
Well, I mentioned that in terms of reality, they put a lot of themselves in it. They use reality, they use real stories. Night of the Shooting Stars, I've mentioned, is deeply autobiographical. It's about their early life as children living in their town and living in Pisa, evacuated to Pisa in the war. And they use other real instances. The very most recent film that Paolo Taviani directed, Leonora Addio, is based partly on a Pirandello story, but it's also based on the true story of Pirandello and what happened to his ashes and how he was finally buried in his hometown of Sicily in many years later. So they use real incidents, they use real people, but they also layer that with fantasy and fiction to create a unique and distinctive blend. So you can definitely look at their films and there are real incidents. The Lark Farm is another example about the Armenian genocide by Turkish soldiers during World War One. So they really do use historical reality and fact throughout their work, but they're not making documentaries. They dramatize it, they fictionalize it, they build upon it to make it something more and different and particular to them. I think that their stories, that their narratives, that their themes, their movies are still very, very relevant to contemporary life and society. Unfortunately, we haven't eradicated war and conflict, and that is a universal theme that transcends time periods. And the way in which they depict war and conflict is very realistic, very contemporary, and I think still absolutely has a resonance, whether it's looking at Rainbow: A Private Affair set in World War II, or Night of the Shooting Stars, or The Lark Farm in World War One, or going back to the Napoleonic Wars as they do in films like Allons Finissant or in Elective Affinities. I think they're drawing on literature and the way they use literature. You know, one of the great examples, I mean, they've adapted Tolstoy, they've adapted Goethe, they've adapted Pirandello, they've adapted Boccaccio, but the great example of their adaptation of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar in Caesar Must Die, whilst using real Camorra criminals in a maximum security prison, is absolutely contemporary. It's amazing. They managed to draw the parallels between the mafia and Julius Caesar and contemporary life in Italy with a play that's 500 years old, and they do that so brilliantly, and that's so contemporaneous. It's extraordinary. So I think that their films are not dated. I think that they have a real echo, a real connection, and watching their films doesn't just help you understand the past or understand the past about cinema, but it also helps you think and interpret the present.
After Bellocchio, Taviani, what's next? Who would Adrian Wootton OBE like to present to the audience?
It's interesting. It's difficult about who I'd like to curate a retrospective of next, because this has been a passion. You know, I've been working on this project to bring this retrospective to the UK for a number of years now, at least 5 years, I think. But there are many other filmmakers many other Italian filmmakers who haven't yet had complete retrospectives in the UK. I mean, I mentioned earlier Nanni Moretti, and I think it's the 50th anniversary of his filmmaking career in 2025. And I'd love to see if we could get a Moretti retrospective. I mean, people are familiar with his work, but again, the whole range of his work hasn't been seen in the UK, and there hasn't been a complete retrospective in the UK. So that's someone I'd love to look at as just one example.